Hello and welcome to Sound Librarian. I'm Stefan Schutz. Ico, Japanese-made game, could only have been made by the Japanese. There's something about the Japanese approach to game concepts and how they come up with ideas that I just don't think the Western aspect of the industry has the freedom to do. I think the Western side of game production is a little bit more conservative. There are a lot of games in Japan that are just copies of other games, but when the Japanese make something original, they can come up with some really outstanding ideas. And I think Ico falls into that category. The sound design is quite minimal, which is very common for Japanese games. The music is beautiful, which is also very common for a lot of Japanese games. So let's have a listen to Ico and see what we can find.
Before I go into the specific details of Ico, I want to cover some of the aspects of Japanese game production in general, because these are very relevant to any discussion to be had about games such as Ico or any of the other Japanese titles that we might look at. And what we're talking about here is a cultural difference in how the Japanese approach game development. And there is very much a cultural difference. There's a cultural difference formed from not just the desire to suit the target market, but also just how the Japanese in general approach a lot of creative things. Japanese games for quite a long time have actually had quite significant stories to them. I would say that the Japanese side of the industry had more developed narrative well before Western game developers headed in that direction. Now, it's interesting, from my memory with a lot of the earlier Japanese games, I always felt that they were just taking too long. There was too much dialogue, and especially on the earlier consoles, it was all just written text. So you'd encounter somebody and you'd have to click through page after page after page of written text before you got to fight them or move on or whatever. What I didn't appreciate at that time was that the Japanese really were telling stories. And as I said, this was far before Western developers were. When Western games all involved just running and gunning, Japanese games were trying to tell stories. Whether the stories were well told or not, or worth telling, is not relevant to the discussion here at the moment. And this also comes from the cultural side of how the Japanese create media. And in fact, as the industry has developed and we've started to have recorded dialogue within games, one of the things that I found out by talking to people whilst I was living in Japan is that in a lot of cases, the voice artists for Japanese games become a little bit like rock stars in their own right. People will buy games because they have their favourite voice artist and they want to see what characters that they are depicting and they want to hear them act. And this is one of the reasons, it's been explained to me, why a lot of Japanese games have very, very long dialogue sections, because people enjoy listening to that particular actor present lots of narrative elements of the game. And a lot of the Japanese games, as I've said, have got far more detail in them. Sometimes what the problem is, and this is definitely the case from years ago, when these games first started to make their way into the Western market, the translations weren't dealt with very well. one of the big things you need to understand about dealing with projects or media of any type in other languages is that a direct translation is never sufficient in portraying what's going on in a story. It doesn't matter whether it's Japanese to English or English to French or any sort of language. There are certain subtleties and also cultural differences in languages that mean that if you do a direct translation, quite often you're losing a lot of the actual meaning. So when it comes to games from other cultures, you need to understand how they approach making the games. Now, with Ico, there isn't actually much in the way of recorded dialogue at all. But what we do have is the motivation for them to tell a complete story in a lot of ways, even if the story is not obvious. So Ico, like a lot of other Japanese games, has a very, very long introductory sequence, far longer than most Western games will ever have. And this is quite common with a lot of Japanese games. You will sit and watch almost like a mini movie before you get to do anything. Whereas with Western games, we tend to incorporate gameplay into the movie segments a little bit more. Again, I'm not putting a judgment value on which manner is better, but it is certainly a thing that with Ico, you will sit through a good 10 minutes of just watching before you get to do anything. And that establishes the story and establishes the character before you get to take control. Now, one of the other things, and this is particularly relevant to Ico, is that from a cultural point of view, as I've said, the Japanese find dialogue very, very important, but they also find music very, very important. In fact, again, the Japanese were pretty much the first people to understand that the fans of games might want to enjoy the soundtrack for a game. So the Japanese have had game soundtracks available to purchase many, many years before the West even considered the idea. So what that means often as a result is that by the time you've got an important musical score and important dialogue, if the game has dialogue, it means that they've kind of filled up the requirements for the audio in some ways. And this is why I've noticed for many, many years that a lot of Japanese games really have very, very basic sound design. And this is where the relevance to Ico comes in. Ico does have very, very basic sound design. Now, it just happens that in the case of Ico, it works because the simplicity of the sound design in this game actually works quite well from making the environment work from the point of view of our main character is very isolated. Our environment is effectively quite empty and there's not a lot going on. So we get that sense of a huge open space and isolation of our characters. Now, I need to say that I think this is just coincidental in the fact that in Ico it happens to work, because in many other Japanese games, I think the lack of sound design does them a bit of a disservice. So they kind of have stylized sound in that they will choose a very small handful of what they consider to be the most important sounds to have, and they will add those to the content of the project rather than lots of details and rich environments. So from the point of view of Aiko, one of the principal aspects of the sound design are the main character's footsteps. Now, interestingly, noisy footsteps is something that quite often I really, really dislike. I think that in a lot of games, footsteps are way too loud and just don't work. They dominate the scene too much. In Aiko, however, I really don't have a problem with this at all. And one of the reasons why is because, again, I think in this case, whether intentionally or accidentally, the loud footstep sounds really, really highlight the main character's isolation. He's in a giant castle structure. And so having his feet flapping away and echoing through these chambers, I think works really, really quite nicely. I think it really highlights this sense that you are just in an enormous space and the space is empty and he's pretty much, at least in this initial stage, he's pretty much on his own. So I think this is an instance where, as I said, the limited sound design aspects of Aiko in this particular case work really, really well. And also I would say that the limited dialogue of this game also works really, really well. I really love the fact that the language in Aiko for both of them is not a real language. I love the fact that it has subtitles. It could almost do without the subtitles. I like the idea of games that present themselves in another language and they either present subtitles or you just have to not understand what's going on. But in the case of Aiko, it works so well because the two characters speak different languages to each other. So there's this communication barrier. And that's part of Aiko's charm. So, a lot of aspects of Aiko are very, very simple. There are no amazing combat moves. There's no selection of lots and lots of weapons. Our main character, once he's rescued the girl, finds a stick. And that's what he gets to use to defend both himself and her against these creatures. And even the creatures, there's a simplicity about the creatures. They are shadowy, they are somewhat amorphous. Some of them may have limbs representative of wings, limbs representative of claws, but everything about this game has a sort of a simplicity to it. The music in Ico is very atmospheric. It does a very good job of... Well, there's two aspects to this. It does a very good job of setting the scene. And of course, there's also some music that has more tension or drama to it whenever you have to deal with one of the adversaries. But it's also not put into this world every single second of gameplay. I refer to that as turning the music into wallpaper. It's just always there, and it's very easy to ignore. I like the fact that there are large sections of this game where the only sound you can hear is the flapping footsteps. Again, it really, really highlights the vastness of this space and the isolation. But more importantly, what it means is that when the music does come in, it's more significant. You pay more attention to it because it's come from nowhere. So when the music comes in, it's highlighting something or supporting something or complementing an aspect of the game. And I think that game developers really need to understand that an absence of sound and music at times can work so well. Often it's what's not playing that can be really, really effective. So there are a lot of elements to Ico that I think are things that have come from the Japanese cultural approach to game development. And this is one of the reasons why this game is significant. One, because it's an outstanding game, but two, because it's an interesting example of looking at how another culture approaches game development. And I think that Western game developers have learnt a lot over the years by looking at Japanese games and understanding some of the ways that the Japanese develop games. And I'm sure the opposite is also true. I'm sure that the Japanese have learnt various things about game development from Western developers. Finally, there is an innocence about Ico that I adore. The whole idea of calling the character and holding her hand and guiding her, and this short little male character is bravely defending her with just a piece of wood. He doesn't know why he's here. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know what he's encountering. But he will lead this character and he will defend this character. And I just like that aspect of the story. I just like the way it's been presented. I like the world. I like that the world is full of ambiguity. We're not really sure why they're here or what's going on. We don't really know much about either of them as we play the game.
I really, really love Ico. Sadly, I can't say that I've finished it. It was one of those games where, as you get further into it, it can get difficult and frustrating. And so it's a game that's very easy to sort of let go of. And I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I had the time at the moment to really continue on with it and complete it, because I think the story is worth it. It's a beautiful world and it's a beautiful idea. And it has some beautiful audio in it. Ico is still available. It was re-released on PlayStation 3 in a twin pack with Shadow of the Colossus. So I would recommend, if you can, hunt one down and have a listen to it. And thank you very much for watching.